The goal was the destruction of the American Pacific Fleet lying at Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
FDR was in his third term as president when the war began. He had guided the nation through the Great Depression. No president was ever more powerful. On February 19, 1942, FDR signed Executive Order 9066. 9066 put the Secretary of War and his commanders in charge of deciding where the military zones would be and who should be removed. It gave the military power over the Attorney General to make these decisions without any hearings or due process. This was unprecedented power for a president, even for FDR. He asked Congress to support Executive Order 9066, and it did.
Congress followed that with Public Law 503, which then gave it power.
The laws did not specifically name any race or ethnic group, but allowed the military to impose restrictions on anyone it deemed a threat. But everyone knew who would be targeted. Military areas were created, and at first, curfews and other restrictions were imposed on everyone of Japanese descent. When the evacuation began on March 22, 1942, newsreels announced its start with a tone wavering between fear and contempt. This one, called Out They Go, never mentions that 2/3 of the evacuees were American citizens, but refers to them by a word we'd never use today.
Japs evacuate vital West Coast areas for the national security. At Los Angeles, 36,000 Japs see the handwriting on the wall and sell out their goods before their voluntary departure.
The evacuation wasn't voluntary, it was the law. And before it even began came mayhem, theft, and loss. People were only allowed to take to the camps what they could carry on their backs. They had to make arrangements to store or get rid of everything else they owned on short notice. The lucky ones got 2 weeks, some only a few days.
Most Japanese Americans had to leave their properties behind. There's lots of incidents when, they were cheated or they weren't given full value for their property. There were a lot of fire sales that happened, so they had tremendous losses.
A congressional report 40 years later detailed some of the loss. One proprietor had to sell her 26-room hotel for only $500. Refrigerators were extorted for $5 or less. One man poured gasoline on his house, determined to burn it down rather than leave it behind. His wife stopped him, saying, "We are civilized people, not savages."
Empty streets and vacated stores stand in shadow. And in the country, the same story, abandoned farms.
All they had left were suitcases, sheets, and blankets. 120,000 people, babies and the elderly. They were searched, some were even tagged. No one knew if they were going to be deported or how long they would be in prison because there were no trials, no hearings, and there was no due process to inform them.
They didn't know what the intention of their government was toward them, and they didn't know what the future held.
The evacuation took almost 18 months. 8,000 actually moved east to parts of the country outside of the military areas to avoid internment. The whole thing took place in stages. First, evacuees were taken by buses, cattle trucks, and trains to nearby assembly centers where they would be checked in for a few weeks before being shipped out to the more permanent internment camps.